The Nicomachean Ethics is a 4th century BCE philosophical work by the ancient Greek thinker Aristotle. It's named after Aristotle's son, Nicomachus, either because it was edited by him or because it's dedicated to him, or both. Aristotle was born in Stagira in 384 BCE and is commonly regarded as the last of the 3 founders of Western philosophy, the others being Socrates and Plato. Just as Plato was Socrates' pupil, so Aristotle was Plato's. Socrates wrote nothing down. He appears in Plato's work mainly as a mouthpiece for Plato's own views, which were entirely rationalist, that is, grounded in reason and distrustful of the 5 senses. Aristotle, by contrast, was an empiricist. For him, reality is this worldly, and we should be wary of rationalist speculation when it takes us too far from common sense. Nevertheless, whereas Plato's works are clear and even entertaining, Aristotle's are dry and even in places obscure. That may be because what we have is his lecture notes. Both he and Plato were teachers. Plato founded a school called the Academy, of which Aristotle became a senior member. After Plato's death, Aristotle founded a rival, the Lyceum, in Athens. Just prior to that, in 343 BCE, he'd been to Macedon to tutor the future Alexander the Great, a connection which caused him increasing political discomfiture as Macedonian relations with Athens worsened. In 322, he went into voluntary exile, and he died that same year at the age of 62. Nowadays, we're used to ethics being synonymous with moral philosophy, the study of right and wrong, good and bad. But that's only a small part of what the ancient Greeks meant by the term. Their term, ethos, meant character or disposition, and is more similar to the modern term ethos, of which it's also the ancestor, than to today's conventional morality. Arguably, most modern moral philosophy is grounded in the Judeo-Christian notion of behavior eliciting the God of Israel's approval, but the ancient Greeks knew nothing of that tradition. Aristotle believed that all natural entities fall into classes, each of which has a purpose, what he called its final cause. The purpose of human beings is to achieve eudaimonia, a difficult to translate term that means something like happiness, excellence, or a life worth living. The way to achieve eudaimonia is to develop a virtuous character by performing the right actions in the right circumstances so regularly and systematically that they eventually become habitual. A wise teacher might help one do that. For Aristotle, there's a lot more to what makes a person virtuous than mere moral behavior. A big part of his ethics is phronesis, practical wisdom, which includes prudence, household management, and political discernment. Wit and charm is another component. He discusses justice and fairness in the 5th of his 10 chapters, and a large section of the book is devoted to intellectual virtues, including the ability to argue rationally, the ability to create artistically, the ability to intuit, and crowning all that, wisdom, which can't be directly taught. One thing everyone knows about Aristotle, and which appears here, is that he thought each virtue lay midway between specific extremes of surfeit and deficit. So, for example, courage is supposedly midway between recklessness and timidity. That would make ethical conduct rather like a craft, which is probably what Socrates thought. The golden mean, as it's sometimes called, is probably one of the weaker parts of Aristotle's ethics. It's often difficult to say what the extremes are, and as Bertrand Russell once asked, what is truth-telling midway between? At the end of the book, Aristotle discusses perfect eudaimonia, which can be found in the highest activity of the highest part of the human soul. The highest part is the intellect, and its highest activity is philosophical contemplation, to achieve which is to access something divine within us. We can imagine the gods doing it, but animals never. Aristotle's ethics made a comeback in the middle of the 20th century in the guise of virtue ethics in the writings of philosophers such as Elizabeth Anscombe and Alistair MacIntyre. Their idea was that moral philosophy had taken a wrong turn round about the time of the European Enlightenment in the 18th century, when it began to consider moral behaviour in isolation from moral persons. The advantage of virtue ethics is that you don't have to agree with Aristotle's particular selection of virtues. Each society can decide its own. It's arguably the basis of the modern-day education system, let society decide what the virtues are, then hire teachers to instill those virtues in children in order to make them into good citizens. Which might sound like a good idea, but unless we're agreed on the virtues beforehand, it could also sound slightly sinister. Which needn't mean there was anything wrong with it 2.5 millennia ago. Over to you.